The Red and White armies feature extensively in Battlefield 1's In the Name of the Tsar DLC, and today, for those of you who aren't entirely sure, I wanted to give you a brief rundown of what the Russian Revolution was, and how exactly it changed Russia. More importantly, I want to show you how that reflects in Battlefield 1's In the Name of the Tsar DLC. In the 1850s, Russia lost the Crimean War to Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. This loss to a multitude of different nations was a huge shock to the aristocracy of Russia, which mostly ran the military, religion, and financial districts of all the country. This was also a huge impact on the Tsar at the time, Nicholas I. Nicholas I happens to be the father of Nicholas II, who featured during World War I and of course the Russian Revolution, which is seen in the Name of the Tsar DLC. This brutal blow to Russian pride and Russian military might led to the emancipation of the serfs. Nicholas I, as well as the aristocrats of Russia, realized that they were incredibly far behind the rest of Europe in terms of modernization and industrialization. Serfdom in Russia is the equivalent of slavery, more or less. You weren't really allowed to own land, you weren't allowed to marry, and you weren't really allowed many rights without the consent of the landowner at the time, who was often a high-ranking aristocrat, military officer, or somebody in a financially better off position. Nicholas I had hoped that in 1861, by emancipating the serfs and freeing 23 million people to own property, marry without consent, and own a business, would massively improve the industrialization process of Russia. What Nicholas I didn't account for was the fact that he had just given 23 million people, most of Russia, the ability to organize and communicate with each other finally for the first time in history. This was especially important in the run-ups to the 1900s and of course the two Russian revolutions in 1905 and 1917, whereby the effective serfdom class and the peasant class had eventually become the working classes of the industrialized Russia. Many of the 23 million peasants that Nicholas I had freed would eventually become workers in factories and mines and key parts of Russian infrastructure, and it was thereby allowing them to organize as peasants and allowing them to organize as working class individuals that they finally began making demands and beginning to strike. After Nicholas I's passing, Nicholas II came to power, and the early 1900s marked him two key problems. First and foremost, the industrialization of Russia had led to a massive population boom, and towns such as St. Petersburg and Moscow had nearly doubled in population in 20 years. This led to overcrowding, poor living conditions, and a new class of Russian industrial workers. The second largest problem he faced was the fact that Russia simply lacked the infrastructure to maintain a well-off society. There were people starving, there were people who lacked basic healthcare, and ultimately Russia was a very destitute place to live in the early 1900s, whereby most working class people had terrible living conditions, terrible food conditions, and were condemned to a very difficult life, especially in major cities. In 1905, Russian workers and working class people organized for the first time against the monarchy. This wasn't an armed uprising or rebellion, but simply a peaceful demonstration against the current running of Russia by Nicholas II. This led to the Bloody Sunday Massacre of 1905, where hundreds of unarmed protesters were killed or wounded by the Tsar's troops. It sparked the Russian Revolution of 1905, where angry workers responded with crippling strikes throughout the country, damaging infrastructure, ruining the ability for Russia to function, and attacking things such as coal mines and natural resources. 9 years later, Russia entered the First World War with a society that simply wasn't working. The working classes were still suffering from terrible conditions, industrialization of Russia was a slow process that meant that most people still simply didn't have basic infrastructure surrounding them, and ultimately Russia as a country was seen as very backwards by most of Western Europe. In 1905, Nicholas II had created the State Duma, which was a representation system for the people, in hopes that this would reduce the calls for reform and quieten the civil unrest. But due to the strains of war, by 1917 people were starving and hungry, especially the working classes, who were made up for the large majority of the population. And in 1917 the February Revolution took place. Demonstrators took to the streets for better living and working conditions, as well as simple necessities such as food, and troops of the Petrograd army, which were loyal to the Tsar, opened fire on them on March 11th, but most of them still maintained on the streets. A few days later, on March 12th, the Duma, which would previously act as a representation system for the working class, formed a provisional government, in recognition that the Tsar no longer had authority over Russia, or no longer had the ability to keep the people of Russia fed and safe. As a result, Nicholas II, who was the Tsar in power, abdicated the throne in recognition that he simply no longer had authority. The first section of the In the Name of the Tsar DLC takes place in up to 1917. Any battles up until 1917 happened whilst Nicholas II was still in power, hence the DLC name In the Name of the Tsar, because the people of Russia, as well as the working classes and peasant classes who had been sent to war, were fighting in the name of Nicholas II. Anything past late 1917 is where the Red and White armies of the Russian Civil War finally come into play, and this happened because of the Bolshevik Revolution. The provisional government at the time, which was founded by the State Duma, was still coming under huge attack from all the people who had supported the initial revolution to get the State Duma into power. There were claims that they simply had not reformed anything enough, and that the State Duma was simply the remnants of an aristocratic system that was no longer in power or had any authority thanks to the abdication of the Tsar. As a result of this, Vladimir Lenin called for a Soviet government that would be directly ruled by councils of soldiers, workers, and peasants, and the Bolsheviks and their allies occupied government buildings alongside other strategic and key positions in the Petrograd city, and formed for the first time a new government with Lenin as its head, and Lenin as the dictator of the world's first communist state. Lenin was backed by the vast majority of the working classes and peasant classes who were willing to fight for him in order to gain what they believed to be a fair society under the writings of Vladimir Lenin. Civil war broke out in late 1917 after Lenin had declared a Bolshevik government, with warring factions including the Red and White armies. The Red Army fought for Lenin's Bolshevik government, and the White Army represented a large group of loosely allied forces including monarchists, capitalists, and supporters of democratic socialism. The odds, however, were against the White armies. Vladimir Lenin had control of key cities, key infrastructure, financial districts, and simply had the support of the wide majority of people. He had a large number of workers and peasants who would willingly fight and die for his cause, and this was much more significant than that of the White armies, who were loosely associated together against the Bolsheviks. A key example of this weakness is the fact that the White Army had monarchists as well as democratic socialists fighting against Vladimir Lenin. Monarchists believed that the Tsar should be the supreme ruler of the country, and democratic socialists wanted an actual democratic voting system for all people, much like modern Western government today. So you can see how there is a clear conflict of interest within those groups, and hence why perhaps some of them were weaker against the Red armies, who were all brought together under one ideology. So to give you a brief summary of how that plays out in the Name of the Tsar, battles up until 1917, as I mentioned, would likely be under Nicholas II, who was the current Tsar of Russia at the time. So any fights between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire would be led by Nicholas II, as well as his commanders, who were mostly his relatives, uncles, and extended family members. Anything after 1917 between the White and Red armies would be between the White armies, which were mostly monarchists and social democrats and capitalists, against the Bolshevik government of Vladimir Lenin. So that was actually an internal conflict which broke away from World War I, but it still featured around the time, which is very interesting to see it actually as a whole in Battlefield 1. So guys, I hope that gives you a good rundown of the Russian Revolution in Battlefield 1 and how it features in the Name of the Tsar. I will be honest with you, I did glaze over a lot of very rich and detailed history very quickly with some pretty big brushstrokes, so make sure you check out more about the Russian Revolution yourself if you are of course interested. As always guys, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you again soon in another video.